The Ottoman Turks had a head start in centralization and firearm technology starting around 1500. The Turks seized Constantinople in 1453, and the leader of the Turkish dynasty declared himself Sultan-i-Rum, the Sultan of Rome, the Caesar of Rome, the ruler of Rome. The Turks tapped into an ancient tradition of declaring themselves emperors of Rome, therefore emperors of all of Europe. But they were outsiders compared to the Christian dynasties in Western Europe. The sultans were Islamic despots. Their authority rested on their claim to be the deputy of the prophet, the caliph. They were the successors of the prophet Muhammad, and they had despotic power. The only people they had to answer to was God and God's law. There was no hereditary nobility. There were no checks and balances. There was no constitutional system. There was simply the will of the sultan. That's a high degree of centralization that did not exist in the West. The sultan then appointed local pusha. These figures were literally the feet of the sultan, and they existed around the Ottoman Empire and governed based upon his will. He did continue an old Roman and old Persian tradition of recognizing local notables. Instead of quashing or killing or imprisoning local notables, sultans used these ayan to control local populations. As long as they bowed to the sultan, they could keep their local customs, their local traditions, even their local religion. There was no requirement to converting to Islam. This brought a tremendous amount of goodwill from local populations. The sultan's power rested upon his Janissary Corps. Janissaries at the beginning of the 1500s were still slaves to the sultan. They came up through a children's levy or a devshrim. The sultan's officials went out into the Christian and Jewish neighborhoods and Greek Orthodox neighborhoods around the empire, took children from their homes as a tax, made them slaves to the sultan, and brought them up within the sultan's household, training them either to be foot soldiers or government officials. In the process, they then converted to Islam. These soldiers, at the beginning of the early modern period, were incredibly loyal to the sultan. The Janissaries were also some of the first in Europe to adopt firearms. And so here you see Janissary weapons around 1657, basically the same weapon that's available in Europe. It's a flintlock musket, smooth bore. And so they had an incredible amount of success on the battlefield using them. They also adopted siege weapons that allowed them to knock down walls. For example, that's one of the reasons they were able to take Constantinople. The Sultan had a head start in centralization and firearms technology. During the course of the 18th century and by the beginning of the 19th century, that lead had vanished. One of the reasons it vanished is because the Janissaries broke out of their previous restrictions as slaves. As slaves, they couldn't have families. As slaves, they couldn't own property. As slaves, they could not engage in anything except what the Sultan wanted them to do. But by the 18th century, they started owning land. They started engaging in trade, in commerce, setting up houses, having families, having children. This made them less than slaves. But they did not lose their prestigious positions within the empire. And during the 18th century, they provided and act as a check on the Sultan's despotic rule. They resisted his authority. They also extracted for themselves, as well as for pushas, as well as for ayans, they extracted the ability to have their own personal or house guards. In other words, the Sultan lost his monopoly on violence. The Janissaries were stationed at the frontier. The Janissary armies were stationed at the frontiers. And to supplement those, the Sultan then called upon these house guards or personal armies to fight alongside. As long as these pushes, or as long as these ayans had been loyal to the Sultan, it wasn't a problem. But when these local elites realize that they now have a power of resistance, they use it to extract concessions from the Sultan. This really couldn't have come at a worse time, because over the course of the 17th and then 18th centuries, the Ottoman Empire entered into decline. Slow at first, but then it begins to speed up, particularly after 1800. 1566 was the maximum height of the Ottoman Empire. It had control over the entire eastern part of the Mediterranean, what would have been the richest part of the ancient Near East, the Greco-Roman world, and had moved into the Balkans and almost reached Vienna, almost conquered Vienna, got all the way up to the gates of the walls of Vienna, and then slowly the Habsburg monarchy, the rulers of Austria, pushed back. And so between 1566 and 1766, the Habsburgs were able to retake or recapture Hungary, establishing it as part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. This made those Danubian principalities, these borderland regions, incredibly important to the power of the Sultan. The local rulers there then had a high degree of autonomy to raise armies and buy firearms to try to push back or resist further encroachments by the Habsburgs. Combine this with the decline of the fighting power of Janissaries, it put the Sultan in a bad position going into the 19th century. So between 1566 and 1766, the centralized authority of the Ottoman Empire fell as other elites inside the Ottoman Empire began arming local populations, raising local armies that were meant primarily to stop external threats. But then once those armies realized, or those local rulers realized, that they could use it to gain more wealth, more power at the expense of the Sultan, they turned on the Sultan. So the 18th century was a period of Ottoman decline.